This is Stateside. I'm Charity Nebbe. The westward migration of the mid-19th century brought many ships to the Great Lakes. The boom in shipping and settlers also brought with it a boom in lighthouses. In 1892, the lighthouse at Old Mackinac Point was built. It's an elaborate construction with the tower resembling the turret of a castle. In the 65 years the light operated, there were only 4 keepers. The third was Henrik Olsen. He served from 1933 to 1951. And as with all the keepers at Old Mackinac Point, Olsen lived with his family at the lighthouse. His son, Ray Olsen, is here today to share his memories of growing up in the lighthouse. Ray, how did your dad become a lighthouse keeper?
Well, he lived on a farm in Aloha, Michigan, and that's 6 miles outside of Sheboygan, Michigan. And him and his brother were delivering a cow to Sheboygan. And to the man that they were delivering the cow to, they had to walk the cow, of course, to Sheboygan. And he was a lighthouse keeper, and he asked Dad if he wanted a job. And so Dad says, sure. And Dad was only 18 years old then. This is 1908. And he started as a laborer at Old Mackinac Point. And he worked, a laborer was the man that took over when somebody went on vacation. And so he was there in 1908 at Old Mackinac Point for a few weeks. And then he went from there he went to Wagashank as a laborer, as a part-timer, and then he was permanently stationed at Wagashank as an assistant keeper.
And where's Wagashank?
Wagashank is west of Mackinac about 10, 12 miles. And he went from Wagashank to White Shoals. White Shoals was 22 miles from Mackinac.
Was he the chief keeper at these sites?
He was assistant keeper he was a second assistant at Wagashank, and he was a second assistant at White Shoals. And he was at White Shoals 6 years.
Wow. How long did people usually serve as an assistant keeper before becoming a keeper?
Well, that depended on whoever was there, and like in Old Mackinac Point, and when Jim Marshall got sick in 1941, Dad was made keeper.
What are the duties of an assistant keeper?
Well, same as a keeper. I mean, they do the same jobs. And at the time, like in 1933, when we moved to Mackinac, there was 2 men, Jim Marshall and my dad. And they worked 12 hours on and 12 hours off, 7 days a week. And they had 2 weeks vacation a year. So that's pretty good duty.
When do you first remember your earliest memories of actually being in a lighthouse?
Well, that was in Racine, Wisconsin. Dad got transferred. We spent a year at Little Point Savo. And then I was a year old when we went to Racine, Wisconsin, Racine Harbor Light. And I was 9 years old when I left there. Of course, I started school in Racine, and the light in Racine was right on the end of a pier. And it was in the bad part of town, too. So I had to go through that when I went. Folks used to have to take me to school all the time because of the bums on the beach and what have you. And I can remember a couple of things that happened in Racine. One night when the steamer Wisconsin sunk right off Racine. And I was just a little kid. It was 1929. And the folks let me stay up that night. And the sea was hitting the breakwater and going right over the house. And hitting the Coast Guard station on the other side of us.
Did you understand what your dad's job was then?
Oh, yeah. Well, he took care of the light. The lights were on the breakwaters there. So he took care of the light and the horn on the breakwater, yeah. And also went out and lit buoys. Sometimes the buoys would go out, and he'd have to go out and relight those.
Why did you move around so much?
Well, Dad got transferred. In 1933, Racine Harbor Light was taken over by the Coast Guard. And so Dad got transferred, and he had a chance to go to Old Mackinac Point. And, of course, he knew Old Mackinac Point because he was there twice before. Mm-hmm. And so we transferred to Old Mackinac Point in 1933, and I was 9 years old.
Describe what Old Mackinac Point looked like when you moved there.
Well, it was, of course, Old Mackinac Point's built like a castle. And when we first moved there, the whistle was steam. Everything, it had a steam fog signal. and they had to shovel coal and get the steam up to blow the whistle. And the whistle blew twice a minute. And I can remember that. Jim and Dad had to keep the steam up and keep the whistle going, and of course the light too. The light was electric, but the light had also to turn the light. They had a clockwork mechanism, and every 5 hours you'd have to go up and wind the clockwork up, wind the weight back to the top of the tower, so the lens would turn. And that used to be my job sometimes at night. I'd make the first run up the stairs and wind the clockwork up. And another thing we used to do in the old days when we first moved to Mackinac, they had visiting hours at the station. They'd let the people go up in the tower. Well, I used to stay down below at the door, and I'd let 6 people in at a time. And when 6 people come out, I'd let 6 more back in. They'd climb the tower and look around. And then the war started, and then everything was off limits. Nobody was allowed on the grounds.
What was the living situation like at Old Mackinac Point?
We had we had steam heat for heat, and no refrigeration, of course. We kept everything in the basement. Then about in 39 or something, we got electric refrigerator. But see, in the old days, like Little Point Sable, there's no water or electric there, and they had to, even the light, the light was powered by an oil wick light, and they had to have that kept constant attention all night long. And of course, Old Mackinac Point there was an emergency light when the electricity would go out. They had an oil lamp they put in. One time in Mackinac, I remember it snowed in November. It snowed for 14 days, and they had to keep that fog whistle going for 14 days. And 2 men doing that, and they got bushed after a couple of weeks of shoveling coal and keeping the steam up.
What was the house like?
The house was just like a normal house. I mean, we had a kitchen and a living room and 3 bedrooms, and there's 2 families living in the house. We lived in one side of the house, and the Marshalls lived in the other side of the house.
Was there anything distinctive about that house that you walked in, you thought, well, this is definitely part of a lighthouse?
Well, the tower, of course, is fastened right to the house. The light tower is fastened to the house, and of course, you go from your dwelling, you go from your house right into the tower without going outside. So they could take care of the light and everything without going outside.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you spent your whole childhood going from one lighthouse to another. Did you think about the fact that you lived in a lighthouse?
Well, yes, it was always different because other kids would live in a house and their dad would go to work and everything, and I always lived in a lighthouse, and my dad worked there. I mean, he didn't have to go to work. That's where he worked, see? So that was the difference.
Did you feel lucky?
Oh, yeah, well, we liked it. I had friends in Mackinac, of course. I lived in town. That was right in town. I had friends and everything, and I'd have friends in, and I'd go to their house and everything,
Did you have a lot of friends who really wanted to come over and see what your house was like?
They didn't pay much attention. No. My friends, they got used to it. Maybe the first time they were there they did, but after that they got used to it. They didn't pay attention, just like me living in a house,
So I know that you sometimes helped with the clockwork, and you had to help out with the summer tourists. What were your other lighthouse chores?
Well, I didn't do much. Well, I'd take out the ashes from the coal stove. That was another one of my jobs. But other than that, I didn't do too much as far as duties at the lighthouse.
Did you think you wanted to grow up to be a lighthouse keeper, too?
I never thought much about it. I never thought much about that. Of course, it had changed by the time that I grew up and graduated from high school. The Coast Guard had taken over the the lighthouse system. Mm-hmm. All the lighthouses were under the control of the Coast Guard then. Like Dad, he in 1939, when the Coast Guard took over, he was automatically in the Coast Guard as a civilian, and he was the boss at Old Mackinac Point until he retired.
How did you feel when your family left the lighthouse?
Well, I was married. I was married then, so I was living my own life, and I didn't have much feeling about it. I was wondering why Dad never stayed in Mackinac, though, rather than he moved down here with me. He could have stayed in Mackinac.
When the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1957, were you following what was going on?
Oh yeah. I knew Jack Campbell was there then, and I knew Jack, and they put the light out in the middle of the bridge. See, they didn't need it Old Mackinac Point anymore because they had the bridge built, and they put the light in the. I think they had a bell out there right in the middle of the bridge, so you couldn't miss it. The steamers, when they, the boats, when they'd go through there, they couldn't miss it.
What did you think when they decommissioned the lighthouse? How did you feel about that?
I was a little sad, a little disappointed because I had been there so long that it was kind of. And I was sad when they closed it up and everybody moved out, and then it sat there as nothing for a number of years, and then they made a museum out of it, and that was for a museum for a few years. And then they closed it again. Now they're rebuilding the lighthouse. They're rebuilding the complete lighthouse, and it's going to be a museum.
Since this is the way that you grew up, and this is obviously your dad devoted 40-some-odd years to this service, when being a lighthouse keeper ceased to be something that you could do with your life, how did that feel to you?
It was a good life, really. It was a good life. We always had a place to stay, and it was always warm. And during the Depression, I didn't know anything about that because Dad was always working. He had a job. Where all my friends, like in Racine, their dads were out of work and everything.
Why do you think it's important to preserve a record of this way of life for people now?
Well, it was a whole different life. And like in the old days, before electricity, a lighthouse keeper was a lighthouse keeper. He had to light the light, and he had to keep it going all night long. And, of course, in the old days, sometimes lighthouse keepers saved lives. A ship would go down or something, and they might take their little boat out and save a life here or there. And so they had a very, very important job.
Well, Ray, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Ray Olson grew up at the lighthouse at Old Mackinac Point, and the lighthouse has been closed to tourists for the last 15 years, but this summer it is reopening. Starting on June 12th, you can tour the lighthouse. Much of it has been restored to what it looked like in the early part of the 20th century, and you'll also be able to go up in the tower. Big Sauble Point Lighthouse at Ludington State Park is another popular tourist destination, but if visiting the lighthouse isn't enough for you, the Park Service allows volunteers to live and work at the lighthouse for 2-week stints. They don't operate the light, which is now automated. They do show tourists around and endlessly sweep the sand off the lighthouse stairs. But each volunteer lightkeeper is also getting a chance to figure out for themselves why lighthouses are such an attraction.
We'd like to welcome you to the Big Sauble Point Lighthouse. Does anybody know why it's called Sauble, Big Sauble?
No.
What does Sauble mean? Sauble means sand.
It's a beautiful area that lighthouses are in with the water, and that always attracts people. They think of the loneliness maybe, or in a lot of books, it's the source of a lot of adventure. You're out here by yourself and have to do for yourself with what you've got. There's the thrill of maybe rescuing someone off of a ship, being the one that's responsible for keeping the light going to make sure that those ships aren't going to crash into the rocks or into the shore. People are trying to capture a lot of that, and we're not in control. It's Mother Nature that's in control.
There's 130 steps from the bottom to the very top. I think lighthouses are very important part of our American history.